Remember those beloved side dishes that graced every church potluck table in the 60s? The ones that turned simple gatherings into memorable feasts that brought the whole congregation and communities together. When did we stop making these classics? Cottage cheese Jell-O salad was one of those curious creations you'd spot at just about every mid-century potluck. A mix of creamy cottage cheese and lemon or lime gelatin, it jiggled its way onto spreads from church basements to family reunions. Folks stirred in shredded carrots, pineapple chunks, even celery. It looked fancy, fed a crowd, and made the most of a tight grocery budget. You'd see it right next to fried chicken or meatloaf, surrounded by Tupperware and laughter. Back then, molded salads weren't just a trend. They were a thrifty way to bring something special to the table. This one came straight from those spiral-bound community cookbooks with curled pages and a little love in every line. Corn pudding casserole was the kind of dish that completed the simplest potluck plate. You'd spot it bubbling in a glass casserole dish, still warm from the oven, right between the ham and deviled eggs. Sweet corn, butter, eggs, and milk, all baked into something soft, golden, and rich. It was easy, affordable, and stretched to feed plenty, making it a favorite at Sunday church potlucks and family gatherings. If you pulled out your grandma's old recipe box, chances are it's scribbled on a worn card in her handwriting. Back then, dishes like this were how folks turned humble ingredients into real comfort meals that had guests coming back for seconds. Celery Victor impressed guests at potlucks like it was ordered from a fancy hotel menu, and those well-loved community cookbooks tucked in kitchen drawers made it possible. The recipe was simple. Boil celery until it becomes tender, chill it in broth or vinegar, and serve it with herbs or hard-boiled eggs. It showed up at holiday gatherings, church suppers, and backyard potlucks, dressed up to look far fancier than it was. Folks back then had a knack for turning plain, budget-friendly ingredients into a company-worthy meal. Celery Victor brought a crisp, tangy bite to the table, and for a time, it stood proudly beside roast beef and casseroles like it belonged there. Macaroni and tomatoes.
Macaroni and tomatoes was a staple when I was little, and they are...
Like we boomers remember it at potlucks, was simple, filling, and always dependable. The commonest way to make it for potlucks back then was to boil elbow macaroni, stir it in stewed tomatoes, add butter, and maybe a little onion or cheese if you had. It wasn't the showstopper, but it always held its place next to pork chops, meatloaf, or leftover ham. You'd find it in community cookbooks from the 40s through the 70s, usually squeezed between casseroles and Jell-O molds. Families brought it to potlucks because folks knew it was a crowd pleaser that needed only what you had at home. Back then, a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes could go a long way, and this dish proved it. Pineapple cheese salad, as many folks remember it back in the 50s and 60s, was a showpiece at potlucks. Canned pineapple chunks mixed with shredded cheddar and mayonnaise, sometimes with a maraschino cherry right on top. It was sweet and just odd enough to make you look twice. Folks who brought it to potluck said they got the recipe out of those spiral-bound cookbooks tucked behind flour canisters in their kitchen. People made it because it was cheap, easy, and unforgettable. It might raise eyebrows today, but back then, bringing this quirky little salad meant you showed up with special side dish. Eggplant dressing, also known as mock oyster casserole, was another side dish you'd see at church potlucks, especially on Sundays. Instead of oysters, as the name suggests, it had cooked eggplant, breadcrumbs, onions, and herbs that were baked into a golden-topped casserole. It was designed to mimic the richness of oyster stuffing without the cost, and it worked. You'd find it filling out holiday tables, stretching garden produce, and bringing a little elegance to even the simplest meal. Recipes like this were scribbled in the margins of old cookbooks, or passed by word of mouth between church friends. Back then, eggplant dressing was the kind of practical comfort meal that made you proud to bring it to the table. Creamy cabbage casserole showed up hot and bubbling on potluck tables across America. Sliced, softened in boiling water, then layered with a creamy sauce, breadcrumbs, and maybe a sprinkle of cheese if you had it. Folks got the recipe for this casserole from the pages of those old community cookbooks where frugal comfort food reigned. Families leaned on dishes like this during the Great Depression and World War II. It was served with either ham or roast chicken, and it sure fed a crowd with care and tradition. Back then, cabbage wasn't just cabbage. It was a warm reminder that hard times didn't mean going without flavor or family. Three-bean salad was one of those oddball dishes that earned its place at potlucks and family dinners in the 1950s and 60s. You'd take green beans, wax beans, and kidney beans, then suspend the whole thing in lemon or lime gelatin, pour it into a mold, and leave it to set. It sounds strange now, but back then, molded salads were a rite of passage in every community cookbook. This one looked impressive, stretched pantry staples, and made sure not a single bean went to waste. People loved it for the bright colors, wobbly texture, and enjoyed it with roast beef or casseroles. It packed protein, vegetables, and just enough retro flair to turn heads. These days, it might only live on in vintage recipe cards, but once upon a time, this shimmering dish was the unexpected star of the potluck table. Parsley baby potatoes were the quiet potluck pleasers no one brings to tables anymore. It was simple, filling, and always fed the crowd without a fuss. Boil baby potatoes, toss them in butter, sprinkle with fresh parsley, and serve them alongside roast beef, fried chicken, or whatever else you have to offer. It wasn't flashy, but that was the point. You'd find this recipe tucked in faded cookbooks from the 30s to the 70s, passed along at potlucks, Sunday dinners, and neighborhood gatherings. Today, it's all forgotten. But once upon a time, parsley buttered potatoes brought warmth, simplicity, and a quiet kind of pride to every shared meal. Carrot pineapple mold was the kind of bright, jiggly side dish you'd find shining on potluck tables across mid-century America. Shredded carrots mixed with lemon-flavored gelatin and crushed pineapple, all molded into a glossy, citrusy dome that added color and crunch to the plate. I know it's unusual today, but back then, molded salads were potluck staples, and this one stood out for its bold color and refreshing bite. Families loved it because it was affordable, easy to make, and brought a little cheer to even the heaviest meals, roast chicken or pork chops. It stretched ingredients and added that cheerful, homemade touch that made meals feel complete, but you rarely see it now. Creamy cucumber slaw was the creamy side dish that quietly made its way onto potluck tables and family spreads, long before store-bought slaw took over. Thin slices of cucumber were tossed in sour cream, vinegar, dill, and just a pinch of sugar to make a tangy, refreshing salad that balanced fried chicken, pork chops, or pot roast. It came straight from those old community cookbooks where frugality met flavor, especially when backyard gardens were overflowing with cucumbers. It was often brought in glass bowls at summer potlucks and reunions, and after one bite, you'd feel relieved from long, hot days in the kitchen. It's nearly forgotten now, but decades ago, this simple dish was a summertime staple. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was the downright elegant side dish you brought to a potluck when you wanted to impress, even if all you had was rice, peas, and a few carrots.
Yeah, we got all kinds of goodness happening here today. Woohoo! What do we got?
This molded dish showed up at luncheons, church suppers, and community gatherings from the 1930s through the 60s. You'd pack seasoned rice into a gelatin mold, let it set, Then fill the center with creamy peas, carrots, and maybe a few mushrooms or green beans if you had them. It was thrifty and had just enough flair to earn a spot at the center of the table. These molded creations came straight from the pages of well-worn vintage cookbooks, and you rarely see them now. But back then, a rice ring like this meant you brought your best, even on a budget. Red cabbage was the tangy side that showed up at family dinners, potlucks, and Sunday suppers for decades. You'd slice red cabbage, simmer it with vinegar, sugar, and maybe bacon or apples. Let it cook until it turned tender and glossy. The result was a rich, sweet and sour braised cabbage, deep in color, with a bright bite that cut right through heavier dishes like roast pork or fried sausage. Rooted in old-world traditions brought by European immigrants, it quietly made its way into American cookbooks by the 1940s. Back when budgets were tight, cabbage was a dependable way to stretch a meal, and folks had to get together to share meals. You don't see it much today unless you're thumbing through vintage recipes or visiting an old German diner. Spinach salad with hot bacon dressing was the hearty side dish that faded when trendier salads took over. And it was a true crowd pleaser. Fresh spinach was tossed with sliced onions, then drizzled with warm bacon grease and vinegar until everything became tangy and savory. Folks ate them to balance casseroles, roast meats, or whatever others showed up with. You'd see versions of it in cookbooks from the 1940s to the 60s, when families knew how to turn garden greens and pantry scraps into a deeply satisfying meal. It was a smart way to use up spinach before it spoiled, and bacon grease before it went to waste. Whether served at church suppers or tucked into handwritten recipe cards, it quietly earned its place at the table. But you hardly see hot bacon spinach salad anymore. Pear salad with cheese and mayo. Someone told me a few days ago that pear salad with cheese and mayo is a punchline to a joke today. And I was surprised at how much this southern staple that was proudly served at potlucks has been forgotten. Yes, the meal was a little strange, but folks loved how it mixed sweet, salty, and creamy in one bite. This oddball dish came straight from the pages of community cookbooks, the kind passed around at church luncheons, backyard gatherings, and women's club meetings. You don't see it much anymore, but back then, spotting those glossy pears meant the hostess went the extra mile, even if the combo raised a few eyebrows. It was nostalgic, it was resourceful, and it was a pure vintage comfort meal. Sour cream noodle bake was one of those creamy, carb-loaded side dishes that didn't make a fuss at mid-century potlucks and Sunday dinners across America. Egg noodles were boiled, then tossed with sour cream, butter, chives, and sometimes a sprinkle of cheese before being baked until hot, golden, and bubbling around the edges. Guests enjoyed it with roast chicken, pork chops, or anything fried. Recipes like this came from the spiral-bound cookbooks of the day. You'd find them at church suppers, casserole swaps, or scribbled on recipe cards passed between neighbors. It was a simple, creamy little treasure from the days when potlucks were a community affair and every dish had a story. Watergate salad, or pistachio delight, as some called it, was that curious pastel green dish that doubled as dessert, confused potluck guests, and delighted sweet tooths in equal measure. It started with a packet of instant pistachio pudding, folded into whipped topping with canned pineapple, mini marshmallows, and chopped nuts. Served chilled in a glass bowl, it looked like something from a retro kitchen display. And that was part of its charm. Back in the 1970s, you'd spot it right there on the table beside glazed ham, turkey, or a bubbling casserole. It came straight from the vintage cookbooks that helped home cooks stretch a few pantry staples into something festive and fun. We'd love to have you stick around. To keep these memories alive, we share stories like this every day on our channel or community. If that sounds like your kind of table, watch any of this video appearing on your screen now. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and we'll see you in the next one.